Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking into a civilization that's, well, far more complex and captivating than many might realize. The ancient Kingdom of Benin.
Absolutely.
This isn't just dry history. It's really a saga, remarkable culture, incredible art, but also a story tangled up in profound political shifts and cultural turmoil.
That's right.
So our mission today is to sift through some fascinating sources, especially A Brief History of Benin by Dr. Afisvad Chayapolfat Sirivadawarvachara. We want to pull out the most compelling insights for you.
Yeah, really get to the heart of it.
We'll explore how this powerful West African kingdom rose, how it flourished, what led to some pretty dramatic changes, and its enduring and often challenging legacy. Get ready, maybe rethink some history.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it really goes beyond just a simple timeline. When you look at the rich oral traditions alongside, the archaeological finds, the history of Benin offers this unique window. You get a real sense of sophisticated pre-colonial African societies and then the transformative, sometimes devastating impact of European contact. We're going to uncover some surprising facts, I think, and critical moments that genuinely reshape understanding.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The foundations, the myths, the geographical heartland of Benin.
The place to start?
Tradition holds that the Benin people trace their origins back to Osinoba, who apparently descended from heaven to a place called Egun. And our sources say he sent a bird east to the Ekins, that's present-day Dahomey, to find people to help him farm his land.
Right.
And the leader of this group, a guy named Ogadokin, was gifted these essential tools: a Neolithic hoe, a chisel-headed bronze, and a sort of potent red wood charm.
And this story, this foundation myth, it really grounds us in Benin's physical reality.
Okay.
Benin City, which was the heart of the ancient kingdom, it's nestled about 80 miles west of the river Niger, right in this high tropical rainforest.
Right, surrounded by others.
Exactly. Bordered by peoples like the Igbos, Yorubas, Ija, or Hobo Itzikiri, strategically positioned really in the temperate zone of the Gulf of Guinea. And linguistically, the Bini people speak a Kwa language,
Which connects them.
which places them within a large West African language family, yeah.
It hints at these broader cultural connections that were already there.
That paints a really vivid picture of the setting.
Yeah.
So from these early roots, how did the kingdom's political structure actually start to take shape?
Well, the kingdom really started to coalesce around the Oba, the king, and a council of 3 other principal chiefs. This kind of pre-colonial political setup was actually quite distinct in Africa.
Interesting.
And our sources credit Oba Eweka with formalizing that title, Oba, as the ultimate political head. He really laid the groundwork for the structured system that would, eventually evolve into modern-day Benin.
And before the Obas, there was another dynasty ruling, right?
Absolutely. That's what's fascinating. Oba Eweka's his reign, it marks this pivotal transition, because for at least 5 centuries before him, you had the Ogiso dynasty ruling. Ogiso?
Okay.
Yeah.
And they had titles like King of the Land or King of the Sea. Now, the term Oba itself only really came into formal use around, say, 1520. But the kings held similar power throughout that time. And interestingly, the last Ogiso, Overamun, ruled much, much later, right up until the British arrived in 1897.
Wow. So that lineage persisted in some way. Now, if you think that's intriguing, let's talk about what our sources call Benin's knotty problem.
Ah, yes.
Because long before any European colonization, Benin had already established this remarkably complex political system. We're talking a masterly bureaucracy, a sophisticated court.
Really advanced for its time.
Totally. The unique civil service, the powerful guild system, these were central pillars of this great civilization.
Yeah.
But what really stands out is how this structure made Benin incredibly difficult to conquer.
Right.
I mean, you have to picture it. Hilly, swampy terrain, really dense vegetation, forest roads that were almost impenetrable, and these independent towns, each basically having its own laws. And then layered on top of that were the so-called protective societies.
They're essentially hired assassins.
Exactly. Hired assassins who held rights of life and death, apparently so powerful and feared that even the highest Oba had to be wary of them. So the insight here really is that Benin's strength wasn't this fragile, easily centralized power. It was more decentralized, almost like a cellular resistance, making it uniquely formidable against outside threats.
That's a great way to put it. This intricate structure really seems to have laid the groundwork for Benin's rise.
So when did this powerful West African kingdom truly step onto the historical stage, become prominent?
It was really around the 15th century. That's when the Kingdom of Benin, there in south-central Nigeria, truly becomes prominent. Early chroniclers even described its powers as imperial.
Imperial.
Yeah. And at its core, there was this profound belief, this idea that individuals of Olokun ancestry, Olokun being a key deity, that these individuals were potentates who protected the temple of the primordial god for the future kings. These figures were seen as the very foundation of the supreme authority, styled Oba, which literally translates to something like a being of divinity.
So that divine authority of the Oba seems absolutely central from the get-go. How did this actually take shape on the ground, in the city itself?
Well, between about 1180 and 1400 AD, this power emerging in the rainforest and river region really began to solidify. The Oba and the city-state structure truly began to form after Herodotus, often considered the first king, settled on the floodplain of the Benin River.
Okay.
And this era, sometimes called the King of Benin, or Didor, saw the city become known as the City of the Obas. And it went through what sources describe as a significant female-like political transformation, which is a fascinating phrase itself, hinting at perhaps shifts in power dynamics or matrilineal influences, maybe.
Interesting phrasing. And this leads us right into the 15th century, often called Benin's Golden Age. What defined this period? What made it golden?
This was really the time when the municipal constitution, with its divinely appointed king, fully came into its own. To consolidate his position, the king established an Igbo shrine right within his palace.
Inside the palace.
Inside the palace. And this gradually evolved into the king's council of chiefs. Initially, there were 6 chiefs, then it grew to 11.
Okay.
And this council was crucial. It played a key role in investing the Oba with greater power, allowing him to control trade more effectively, collect taxes, and exert influence over those vital river ports. It really cemented his authority.
Sounds like a period of immense growth and consolidation. But did this expansion come at a cost? Was there a downside?
Unfortunately, yes, there often is, isn't there? King Ewer's extension of the kingdom, while making Benin more powerful, also generated, well, significant ill will among neighbors. Our sources even suggest that Illyrian kings, likely feeling threatened by Benin's growing power, actually shared information with the Portuguese.
Really?
Yeah. And this seemingly led to a treacherous advance, culminating tragically in the slaying of Oba Esegi and what's described in stark terms as a bloodbath of destruction.
Oh, wow.
The period was marked by, ghastly murders, fields being ravaged, shrines destroyed, plus plague and famine on top of it all. It's a really sobering reminder, as our source grimly puts it. Savagery begets savagery.
A dark side to the Golden Age. Let's shift, though, to a more celebrated aspect, Benin's breathtaking cultural achievements. I mean, Benin City and its Obas are practically synonymous, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Even today, if you visit the city, you're engaging with the palace's history. And before the British arrived, this kingdom was a vast empire stretching across southern Nigeria, all governed by this hierarchy of blood-related Obas.
And the artistry, the sheer scope of Benin's art traditions, it's just remarkable. You're talking about incredibly intricate sculpture in wood, ivory, stone, terracotta, really sophisticated casting in bronze and brass, making glass beads, elaborate inlaying with brass, silver, paste, coral, delicate carving in gold and silver, even detailed decoration of leather, textiles, pottery. It's an astonishing range.
It really is.
And crucially, Benin art isn't really tied to individual artists in the way Western art often is, with named masters.
Right.
It's identified collectively with the kings, with the Obais of the Benin kingdom themselves. And here's a really interesting distinction our sources highlight. The British concept of art appreciation, where artworks are priced, put in galleries for public admiration that was simply absent. These pieces held a deeper, non-commercial significance, often spiritual, historical, or ritualistic.
That's a really crucial insight into their worldview, isn't it? Now, when people talk about Benin art, they often immediately think of those incredible bronze and brass castings, even though, as you said, wood carving was just as indigenous. Can you tell us more about those iconic metalworks?
Indeed. Those bronzes are world famous for a reason. Oba Ola is credited with establishing bronze casting in Benin. The ores themselves were apparently wrought in state-run mines.
Okay.
Yeah, and then given to artisans. And get this, sometimes the king himself had to take extraordinary measures, our sources say, even pawning his wives, to finance these ambitious projects.
Oh, that shows the importance placed on them.
Absolutely. And these intricate works, they depict human heads, often idealized representations of Obas or queen mothers, but also historical events. There were plaques, for instance, made for burial ceremonies, illustrating legends and royal occasions. And they use that incredibly sophisticated lost wax process.
Can you explain that briefly, the lost wax process?
Sure, it's a remarkable technique. You meticulously sculpt the model in beeswax, covered in layers of clay to create a mold, then heat the mold so the wax melts and runs out, hence lost wax. That leaves a cavity inside the hardened clay mold, perfectly shaped like the original wax model. Then you pour molten metal, like bronze, into that cavity.
Right.
Once it cools and solidifies, you break away the outer clay mold, revealing the metal sculpture within, often incredibly detailed and hollow.
That's truly ingenious craftsmanship, and there was a significant historical debate about where this art originated, wasn't there, about diffusion?
Absolutely, a major one. The question of cultural diffusion, particularly whether Benin art was influenced by or derived from the art of Ife, another important cultural center nearby, is still a subject scholars investigate.
Ah.
But a critical turning point came, almost accidentally, with carbon dating. Scientific tests showed that most of these artifacts had actually been produced centuries before any significant contact with Europeans.
Right. That's huge.
It was absolutely pivotal. This scientific evidence effectively debunked the prevailing, frankly racist theory at the time that such sophisticated artworks produced in Africa must have had European origins or influence. It was a crucial correction in art history.
That powerfully demonstrates the kingdom's indigenous genius. So beyond the physical objects, how did these artistic and cultural traditions manifest in daily life, in celebrations?
Well, Benin's traditional festivals were incredibly vibrant, a real tapestry of cultural expression. You had celebrations like Edikin, which honored Amal Sarame and Bikua, their foundational deity, the creator of first life.
Okay.
And others like Ajiwa. These were incredibly elaborate events. You have to picture grand assemblies of chiefs, the royal thrones adorned with rich fabrics, dancers performing intricate steps to honor deified ancestors.
So spectacular.
Which really does. Now, while these traditions persist in many ways, our sources do note that the king's direct role in, say, resolving disputes has somewhat diminished in modern times compared to the past.
And how did Benin fit into the bigger picture, the broader regional political landscape? Was it isolated?
Far from it. Benin played a really significant role in West African regional politics. Historically, it engaged actively with neighboring powers like Oyo, Ijebu, and Igbira. There seems to have been a level of mutual respect, often with other influential West African capitals.
So it was a major player.
Definitely. And this wasn't just about military might or diplomacy. Think about King Esigi's urban planning back in the late 15th century. Our sources suggest he laid the foundation for a truly great civilization, marked by impressive functional monuments. We're talking city walls, moats, well-planned roads, numerous shrines, real infrastructure.
That sets the stage perfectly for a dramatic turning point in their history. Let's move now to that pivotal moment, European contact. This period would fundamentally reshape Benin's destiny, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, a watershed moment.
So when did the first European ships arrive on the scene?
The very first Portuguese ship reached the Bight of Benin, that's the coastal area near Iko, which is modern-day Lagos, in 1372. There were follow-up visits in 1480 and 1488.
And what was their initial reaction?
Initially, the explorers were actually a bit underwhelmed. They found mostly timber, dried food, fish. Not the gold or spices they might have hoped for.
Right.
But they soon started hearing rumors, whispers, of a great and rich kingdom further inland. And they eventually identified this as Benin. The Portuguese managed to reach Benin City proper in 1472, bearing gifts for the Oba.
And how was that first contact?
It seems that initial contact led to an agreement, sort of a trade deal. The Oba apparently sought military protection and luxurious European goods, and in exchange, he offered Benin artifacts.
So it sounds like it started perhaps on somewhat mutually beneficial terms, but tragically, that changed dramatically, didn't it?
It really did. That initial welcome from Oba Iwer I, who encouraged trade from 1472 onwards, took a very dark and tragic turn around the year 1600. European motives profoundly shifted.
Oh, so?
Our sources are explicit here. They detail the violent introduction of the odious slave trade. European merchants essentially turned their attention away from commodities like palm oil and cloth.
Back into human beings.
Towards human beings. Africans were captured, often far in the interior, then sold to coastal kings or middlemen in exchange for iron bars, manufactured goods, and crucially, guns.
Right, which fueled further conflict.
Exactly. These captured people were then imprisoned in horrendous conditions near the coast before being shipped off across the Atlantic. Our source chillingly calls this the start of the Great Race Relations War. something that shook the very foundations of civilization and led, it notes, to enormous losses to the conquering nations as well, though obviously incomparably worse for the enslaved.
And this horrific trade, as our sources starkly explain, fundamentally marked the end of Benin's golden age, didn't it?
Yes, it brought, quote, enormous wealth, luxury eating, excessive drinking, the felling of the most precious trees, and abandonment of many picturesque villages and hamlets.
Devastating.
Utterly. Whole kingdoms were disrupted or destroyed. Once prosperous nations were finished, the very fabric of society across vast regions was torn apart by this trade.
And this horrifying shift was happening just as the broader scramble for Africa was intensifying across the continent.
Exactly. Colonial expansion in West Africa really accelerated after the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, where European powers literally sat down and drew up the so-called rules of Africa, carving up the continent amongst themselves.
Unbelievable.
And Benin found itself directly in the path of this aggressive colonial process, witnessing the systematic destruction of its illustrious heritage.
Which brings us inevitably to the infamous 1897 British invasion, often tragically referred to as the Benin Massacre. What led to that?
Our sources detail the immediate trigger. In December 1896, a British delegation, consisting of traders and some troops, heading towards Benin City against the Oba's explicit instructions, was ambushed by forces loyal to Oba Ovenromwen.
Okay.
This ambush, where most of the British party were killed, served as the immediate pretext for swift and overwhelming British retaliation. Punitive expeditions were launched, culminating in the siege and capture of Benin City in March 1897.
So the city fell.
Yes. It was breached in early February, and resistance was overcome by March. 6 treaties of annexation were quickly executed, effectively extinguishing Benin's independence.
And the aftermath. What happened once the British were in control?
The aftermath was truly devastating, and it set a terrible precedent for colonial plunder across Africa. Benin City was systematically looted. We're talking about soldiers, administrators, shipping agents, customs officials, all taking part, apparently with the explicit approval and even patronage of the British government back home.
Just state-sanctioned looting.
Pretty much. And this act directly led to the mass removal of Benin's artworks from Africa. Our sources estimate around 2,500 significant religious and historical artifacts. Basically, Benin's visual history carved in bronze and ivory were confiscated and sent to England.
2,500.
Around that number. Yeah. And the vast majority remain, even today, in institutions like the British Museum. This event was even described, perhaps cynically, by some at the time, as the first act of internationalization of Benin work of art. There's even a report mentioned in our source of a museum director telling the invading soldiers to basically get the valuables by all means necessary.
Unbelievable. Okay. Let's fast forward now to the mid-20th century. The world had changed, World War II was over, and the demands for independence were sweeping across European colonies. How did this play out in Benin?
Right. In Benin, which was under French colonial rule by then, the French government was initially quite reluctant. But eventually, the 1946 Constitution allowed for some native representation.
Small step.
A small but crucial step. It led to Louis Benin becoming the first African to sit on the government council. And from this point, political parties began to properly form. The Union Démocratique Beninoise, the UDB, emerged as a particularly successful and influential one early on.
But the path to full independence wasn't smooth, was it?
Far from it. The sources describe it as being marked by intense internal factional struggles, deep rivalries between these newly formed parties. This led to quite a bit of instability, with cabinets collapsing frequently in the early 1950s. Sadly, it even spilled over into tribal and ethnic violence at times, resulting in assassinations and forcing some political leaders to flee the country.
A turbulent time.
Very turbulent. But despite these immense challenges, Benin did achieve self-governing colony status between 1950 and 1953. And during this period, significant steps were taken towards Africanizing the civil administration, preparing for eventual full independence.
What's particularly insightful from our sources, though, are the economic challenges that really solidified under colonial rule. It seems development wasn't prioritized in Benin the same way it might have been in, say, neighboring Nigeria.
That's a key point.
Yeah.
This often resulted in many settlements being pushed or even forced to concentrate entirely on a single cash crop, chosen by the colonial authorities, not necessarily what was best for the local economy or people.
Right.
Our sources give the example of rubber cultivation. After some initial failures, it did eventually become a leading export crop by the 1950s. But it vividly illustrates that broader pattern of constrained, often coerced, economic activity focused on extracting resources for the colonizer.
Okay, so moving into the post-independence era proper, Benin officially became independent on August 1st, 1960. What did that period look like?
Well, initially you saw a rapid increase in the number of civil servants, as you'd expect with a new nation building its administration.
Hmm.
Yet there was a noticeable lack, according to our sources, of Benin's individuals in the very highest ranks of key ministries,
Yeah.
like finance or foreign affairs. Power structures perhaps didn't shift overnight.
Right. And politically, was it stable?
Not particularly, unfortunately. The post-independence period was also characterized by significant political instability. There was a military coup in 1969, for
I
instance.
don't.
This eventually led to a presidential regime under General Carriacou and the establishment of something called the High Council of the Revolution, which was composed entirely of soldiers, so a period of military rule.
And this brings us back, in a way, to one of the most poignant and enduring challenges we touched on earlier, the issue of cultural property restitution.
Yes, a very live issue.
Despite Benin's incredibly rich cultural heritage, that heritage was severely compromised by the colonial looting, wasn't it? And this hampered efforts at cultural reconstruction after independence.
Absolutely. While some bronze and ivory artworks have, thankfully, been recovered or returned over the years,
A small number.
a relatively small number, yes,
Yeah.
a vast quantity still remains in foreign museums and private collections. And often, as you said, they're displayed as trophies of conquest or, even more disturbingly, framed as specimens of primitive art.
Which is just.
Our sources don't mince words. They call this situation a mockery of civilization in museums. It's a deep wound.
It really is. And this historical context, this loss, surely connects to the present day. What are the current socioeconomic realities in Benin?
Well, the legacy is complex. Today, the nation faces significant challenges. Our sources point to things like inadequate transport and communication infrastructure, persistent power shortages, high rates of unemployment, national poverty, and a concerning brain-drained skilled people leaving for opportunities elsewhere.
And education plays a role.
It seems so. The poor standard of education is highlighted as something that exacerbates these issues. Apparently, many secondary school graduates struggle to meet university entrance requirements, which perpetuates a cycle of limited opportunity for many.
So, given this incredibly tumultuous yet also profoundly resilient history, what does it all mean for Benin's future, its identity?
That's the big question, isn't it? The history of its power structures, its civil administration, was undeniably dynamic, constantly changing, facing challenges. You had monumental shifts under leaders like Oba centuries ago. The monarchy itself, which still exists in a cultural capacity.
Right.
It has faced continuous challenges throughout its history, including, for instance, the historical dominance of powerful figures like the Ias, the prime minister, essentially who was sometimes even portrayed as an antagonist to the Ubia in art and laments, particularly during the colonial period when power dynamics were shifting rapidly. It's a history defined by constant flux and adaptation, but also, remarkably, by profound continuity in certain core traditions.
And what about the cultural heritage that does remain in Benin?
That's the note of hope, perhaps, to conclude on that. While so much of its tangible cultural wealth was destroyed or carried away by the British in 1897, the Royal Palace complex in Benin City still stands today. It's a grand structure, a powerful symbol, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
That's important.
Very important. And perhaps even more crucially, the intricate bronze production technique, that amazing lost wax casting process we discussed, and the specialized knowledge required to do it, that still survives. It's practiced by artisans in Benin City today. That represents a vibrant, living link to their incredible artistic legacy.
What an absolutely incredible journey we've taken today. From Benin's foundational myths and its sophisticated pre-colonial governance through the truly devastating impacts of European contact, the slave trade, colonialism, right up to the ongoing struggles for independence and the complex challenges Benin faces today.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. The story of Benin is such a powerful testament, isn't it, to human resilience, to artistic genius, but also to the complex and often very painful intersections of global history. It's a stark reminder of how much there is to learn when you really dive deep into the sources.
Absolutely. And maybe this leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to consider. There's an ancient Benin proverb that states, "When the mighty hunter kills a goat, he should not eat its flesh alone."
Powerful.
It is. So what does this powerful proverb mean today in the context of the continued holding of Benin's looted art in museums far from home? What responsibility do societies, institutions, individuals have in helping to write the next chapter of this incredible civilization story, particularly when we think about what a true African Renaissance might look like if and when its full heritage is finally restored and reunited? Something to think about.